With hundreds of tanks available, how do you pick the right one? Well, I'm going to tell you exactly how. So the first thing to consider is going to be water volume. So the biggest thing with water volume is that it's going to be easier to take care of a larger tank to a certain point. The analogy that I like to use is if you take a drop of poison and put it in a 5-gallon tank, that's going to do a lot more harm than if you were to put that same drop of poison in this 80-gallon tank behind me. When you have swings, they're going to be happening a lot more frequently on a smaller tank than a larger tank. For instance, when your salinity raises up because your water evaporates on the tank, it's going to affect the smaller tank a lot more. What'll happen is you'll have swings in other elements, so things like magnesium and calcium will jump up to be higher because the salt's now making up a larger portion of the water volume. Now, what this can lead to is harmful swings that can hurt corals, and even if it doesn't kill them, it can irritate them and cause them to not grow as well as they could be. So usually I recommend going for a larger tank. Now, this does have a caveat. Obviously, you don't want to go for a massive tank because water changes are going to be a lot more of a pain. I would recommend anywhere from a 15-gallon to a 40-gallon. These are going to be your best options when it comes to a beginner tank. One other thing to remember about more volume is it's going to require more equipment. So the 80-gallon behind me has 2 Kessel lights on it. Now, if I had a 40-gallon, I could operate with just one of these lights. So it is important to consider that it's not just the cost of the tank, it is also the cost of the equipment that's going to go up with a larger tank. So I usually recommend going for the biggest one that you can afford. Really, as big as a 75-gallon would do well for beginner, but it is going to be a little bit more of a hassle to do water changes. So the next consideration is whether you want a glass tank or an acrylic tank. Glass is going to be a lot heavier. Acrylic tanks are way lighter. They're less than half the weight, and so it makes them a lot easier to move around, especially if you have a larger tank. But with that lower weight also comes lower cost. So acrylic tanks are also usually cheaper to manufacture and purchase than glass tanks. So it makes them a good starter option if you're trying to save a little bit of money and get a bigger tank. However, one thing to remember about acrylic tanks is that they do scratch very easily. So any little piece of sand that can get caught on like a scraper or anything can scratch it, and scrapers themselves can actually scratch it. So you can't use traditional metal scrapers like you can on glass, which makes them a little bit harder to clean because you have to use a plastic scraper in order to not scratch the acrylic. With glass tanks, you can use metal blades and it makes it really easy to clean. So now that you've got your glass or acrylic tank picked out, the next thing you're going to want to look at is whether you want a rimmed or rimless tank. Now with acrylic tanks, they're usually all rimless, and if there is a rim, that is usually just added for aesthetic purposes. But when it comes to a glass tank, the rims do provide necessary support in a lot of cases. And if you've ever seen a standard aquarium, like a standard 10-gallon at PetSmart or Petco, they are usually rimmed with a black piece of trim. Now, as you can see, the tank behind me is completely rimless. There is a concern that over time it could burst because there isn't that rim. Now, what you can do to avoid this is really just sticking with trusted brands. The Red Sea tanks have in the past been known to pop, but one, it's usually possible to see before they burst, and two, the new ones come with actually armored seals and thicker silicone. There really isn't that much of a difference between rimmed and rimless tanks other than just the look of it, and rimmed tanks are going to be a little bit more secure. So the next thing to consider is going to be the type of tank you're looking at. So there's a few different types and styles. There's peninsula style. There's a standard tank like this one right here behind me, where it's usually going to be longer than it is deep. And then the final kind is going to be an island style tank. So these tanks are largely based on where the overflow is. Now, what is an overflow? The overflow is where the water is either removed from the tank and goes down to the sump or filtration, or where the filtration actually is. So in our innovative marine tank, there's a little filter in the back. And so that is our overflow section. When you get into larger tanks, what'll happen is a peninsula tank will have the overflow basically on this side, if we're looking at this 80-gallon behind me. And what that means is the tank will usually extend out into a room. Now, an island-style tank will usually have the overflow in the center, and that'll be a tank that is freestanding in the center of a room usually. So where the overflow is placed is going to have a large effect on not just the style of tank and where you position it in your home, but also it's going to have an effect on your flow. So if you have a peninsula style tank, especially if it's longer, it can sometimes be difficult to get adequate flow across the entire distance of the tank because your return pump is putting out the water on this side, but it has to travel all the way over to the other end of the tank. Now, if you have a more standard tank where the overflow is in the back, it's usually pretty easy to get across the tank, and you can also add a lot of power heads back there that will circulate the water. But on a peninsula tank, sometimes it won't look great for you to have power heads on this side of the tank where it's out into the room. So it's really just important to consider how you're going to get flow into your tank before you're picking a peninsula, a standard, or an island tank. The next way to classify tanks is based on the filtration system that they will use. So as we've gone over with our tank, it's an all-in-one, and what that means is the filter is completely contained within the tank itself, and it's in that back section that we talked about in our previous video where we went over our tank. Now, these are probably going to be the best for beginners up to a certain size. I'd say up to 40 gallons, they work pretty well. Any bigger than that, and there's just not enough water volume to filter the water adequately, so I usually recommend at that point switching to a sump. Now, in order to get a sump, there's a few different things you can do. The easiest is to purchase a drilled tank. What that means is there's already a hole in there, and you simply add a bulkhead onto there, and you plumb the tank down to the sump, which is going to be basically a little tank underneath that filters your water. This is how we filter pretty much every tank here at the store, and it's pretty simple, although it can seem overwhelming, but really, you can purchase these sumps pre-made, or you can build one yourself. All it is a tank underneath with a few dividers in it that separate the different types of media, just like in the all-in-one filter that we looked at in the previous video. Now, there is another type of tank that is non-drilled. These are usually the kind you'll see at places like Petco and PetSmart. These can be a pain because unless you're running a hang on the back or canister filter, which can work for smaller tanks, but really isn't ideal, you're going to have to drill these by yourself or look at a overflow box that doesn't require drilling. Now, the thing with these overflow boxes is they are very loud because they're constantly starting and stopping a siphon, and they can lead to flooding just because they aren't drilled into the tank itself and require a siphon. So if that siphon gets messed up, you can end up overflowing or flooding your tank or the sump, and they just aren't the most reliable, and I usually try to avoid them. Overall, all-in-ones are definitely going to be my go-to for any beginners because they're going to be the easiest to maintain and take care of, and you don't have to worry about learning how to plumb. If there's any sort of mistake in your plumbing, or if you forget to glue a joint, that joint can pop off and then lead to a flood all over your tank, which can lead to a catastrophic error. All right, so the final thing we're going to talk about in this video is going to be considerations for your stand. Now, if you have a smaller tank like us, this 15-gallon, it can go on a solid table or countertop. As long as it can hold the weight of a person, it should be able to hold the weight of this tank just fine. Any bigger than that, and you might want to either build or purchase a stand. Now, usually, any type of tank that you're going to buy will have a stand option that you can also purchase with it, especially the Red Seas and water boxes. They're going to come with the stand already, so you have that squared away. Now, when it comes to building a stand, I usually use wood just because I'm not very good working with metal. One thing to consider is that you want to select a high grade wood. I usually recommend pressure treated wood if you go to build a wooden stand. Now, a lot of the stands nowadays are made out of particle board, and while this can be very cost effective and look very clean, one thing you need to remember is that if any water gets into it, it can start to come apart, and especially over years of saltwater use and getting saltwater dripped on it, they'll tend to come apart and start to split, which can damage the integrity of a stand. Now, what a lot of people will do is a hybrid approach where they build the actual support structure out of wood and then wrap it with some sort of either plywood or particle board. This enables you to eliminate the risk of particle board getting wet and degrading the structural integrity of your stand. However, it does give you the ability to still make it look nice and not like a little bit janky like some of our stands look here at the store. There is also the option of fabrication either with aluminum or steel. A lot of custom aquariums that are larger will come with these steel stands, especially glass cages. I know we order a few tanks through them, and they've always come with these steel stands, which definitely work very well and can be wrapped similarly to the wood stands. But again, unless it's powder coated or painted like those stands that we get from glass cages, you are going to need to worry about rust from the saltwater. This is definitely a concern, but as I said, as long as you wrap it with some sort of material, it's not really too much of a concern and should hold up really well over the years. Now, another thing to consider about the stand is you do want space not only for your sump, if you have a sump, but also storage for some of your aquarium gear. Now, even if you think you aren't going to get a bunch of gear, you're going to end up with a bunch of gear. You're going to have foods for your corals, foods for your fish, all sorts of little gadgets, testers. So I definitely recommend at least having some sort of shelf or a little side section where you're able to store some of your equipment and things like that. Even if you're not planning on it, it's always better to have more storage space than less when it comes to this hobby because you always end up with more junk than you thought you would have. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed episode 2, selecting a tank in our beginner reefing series. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe. If you want to check out one of our other videos, you can check one out down here. And if you guys want to check out our website where we have over 1,100 what you see is what you get corals, you can check that out right here. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to leave it a like below and comment what size tank you're thinking about if you're starting a new tank, or what your first tank size was in the comments down below. And I will see you guys in the next one.